want to invite you this morning to think about a time in your life that you would describe as a mountaintop experience. An event, a moment, or even a short period of time in your life when you just felt that you were on top of the world. Okay, you racking your brains trying to think. Could have been a sudden moment of clarity, or maybe a time when you experienced God in a way that totally changed how you thought about yourself and how you thought about the world. Or maybe it was a really great vacation or a graduation, the kinds of times when we're able to celebrate something that we've worked really hard and have finally achieved. Okay, do you have that moment in your mind? Do you remember how it felt? Do you remember who was with you, where you were? And do you ever just wish that you could have just pushed pause on that moment and just stayed there forever? I've had a couple experiences like that. When I was winding down my semester at the University of Barcelona, I finished my exams and then went backpacking through Scotland and France. And while I was in France, I stopped for a week at a quasi-monastic community called Taizé, which is known mostly for its music, but also for its commitment to reconciliation. And it was during my time at Taizé that I had an experience of God that completely blew my mind and changed the way that I thought about the cross. Because I had been raised in a tradition that taught me to look at the cross and to be reminded of my shame and my sin and my guilt. And for the first time in my life, at Taizé, I was able to look at the cross and see in it the enormity of God's love for me. And so after worship that night, I was walking back from the chapel, and I just looked out over the French countryside and sat there and paused for a moment and thought, it's too bad I can't just stay here forever. Can you relate to that? Yeah. There's something that seems to be hardwired into us. When we're flying high, when everything's going really well, when we just want to push pause and live in that moment forever. And that also means not have to worry about anything that comes after that. You know what it's like when you're on vacation and you are just having the best time, but then all of a sudden it dawns on you that you're going to have this giant pile of work waiting for you when you get back, and probably all the emails that are in your inbox. Yes, I know that feeling. And so you do just want to push pause. And speaking of hardwired, I've been told that when I was 2 years old, just a couple of weeks before I was about to turn 3, my mom started talking to me about my birthday party and who we were going to invite and what it was going to be like to turn 3 and how great that would be because it meant that I would be going to school in the fall. And instead of being really excited, like you might expect, I just stood there and I said, I don't want to be 3. I want to be 2 forever. And then every time someone else would talk to me about my birthday party throughout the next several weeks, that's what I would tell them. They'd just be like, whoa, okay. Won't talk to her about that. And so I guess in my 2-year-old little mind, I was on top of the world. I was on that mountain, totally happy with the way things were, hanging out with mom, drinking apple juice. It was great. And whatever 3 had in store for me, I didn't want anything to do with it. I just wanted to stay where I was. And as funny as that sounds, I think that's a lot of what Peter was feeling in our gospel reading this morning. Peter, James, and John had been following Jesus around for a good while, listening to him speak, watching him perform miracles. But one day, in this day that we heard about today, Jesus took them up to a mountain. And suddenly on this mountain, Jesus was transfigured, or he was transformed right before their eyes. And suddenly they were able to see him for who he really was, see him in a way that they had never seen him before. It blew their minds. And did you notice what Peter said? Anyone notice? If you have your bulletins, you can actually flip over to the back and follow along with this. What does Peter say? He says, Lord, it is good for us to be here. And immediately then he asked Jesus if he can go ahead and set up 3 tents, one for him and one for Moses and one for Elijah. It's good for us to be here. He's overcome with amazement, probably a little bit of euphoria. And so it's kind of like Peter saying, Jesus, this is great. Wouldn't it be awesome if we could just camp out and stay here forever? And can you really blame him? Y'all have heard of that phrase, timing is everything, right? Okay, I think that is something that is especially true with the Bible, and it's something I invite you to notice as you read your Bibles at home and listen to it in worship. There's a little subtext in what Peter is saying that we don't really pick up on unless we know what comes immediately before this story. And so right at the end of chapter 16 in Matthew's Gospel, it's when Jesus starts talking about his death. It says, "From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised." Do y'all remember how Peter reacted? He said, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." And I'm sure you remember Jesus' response. He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me, for you're setting your mind on human things, not on divine things." And immediately then Jesus turns to his followers and he looks at his disciples and he says, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." So I invite you to try to put yourself in Peter's shoes for a minute. You've been following this guy Jesus around, and he seems to have a lot of things going for him. You've heard teachings that have blown your mind. You've seen people who are healed from diseases that in your mind were incurable. And you've seen 5,000 people fed with 7 loaves and 2 fish. And somehow you've been convinced in your heart of hearts that this is the Messiah. This is the one who's come to save Israel, to save it from captivity. And suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, Jesus begins to tell him that he has to die. And not only that he has to suffer and die, but you know what, Peter? You've got to come with me. So can we really blame Peter then for wanting to stay on that mountain? I mean, to dwell in that place where the power and majesty of God seem more real and more tangible to him than ever before. I can't blame him. I'm sure I would have said something maybe a little less eloquent. I'd probably be like, "Hey, Jesus, remember all the crazy stuff you said earlier this week? Can we just forget about that and stay here?" Yeah, any of us probably would have done the same thing. And while Peter's still trying to get his words out, this blindingly bright cloud descends upon the mountain, and suddenly God announces that Jesus is God's beloved Son and tells them to listen to him. And so then you can imagine that all of those words from the previous week just come flooding back to them. And suddenly they're overcome by fear as they recognize the enormity and the magnitude of all that Jesus had been saying and what was awaiting them when they came down that mountain. It's good for us to be here. Those were Peter's words. And it's really tempting for us to stay put whenever we're comfortable, where we're safe, particularly as it relates to our faith, especially when in our faith walk we have no idea what lies ahead, or when maybe we have a sense of what lies ahead and it scares us. But the disciples couldn't stay on that mountain. Jesus had a journey to finish toward another mountain called Calvary, and he had invited them to follow him there. And so just like Peter and James and John couldn't stay on that mountain with Jesus, we can't stay on our own mountains either. I think that's an especially important word for us as Glenmar Church as we look around, and you can't help but seeing all the ways in which God is at work in this place. You look at ministries and you see the ways in which God is being glorified, and each week new people are coming through our doors to love and to walk with in faith. But even though it's really tempting for us to stay here, God's calling us to step forward in faith. We might not know what the future holds, just like the disciples, but we also have the advantage of seeing the bigger picture, knowing that in following in faithfulness, in death, it gives way to new life. Obedience leads to transformation. And so, we take that step down from the mountain in faith. And then today in the church calendar is another mountain of sorts. We hear these stories about Moses, the one who led God's people out of slavery and into the promised land, and this story about Jesus, the one who leads us out of slavery to sin and death and to the promise of new life. And we're reminded of how the glory of God was revealed on two mountaintops so powerfully. Our music is full of praise, full of the mighty power of God, songs that say Alleluia. And yet here we are standing on this mountain and we look down into the valley. We see a 40-day journey toward the cross in Lent. Now, I don't know about you, but growing up, the thought of Lent always made me uncomfortable. Because each Lent, we are reminded of this call to die with Jesus. Not die literally, but to die to ourselves, to our sin, to our ambitions, to our pride, so that Jesus can live in us. We're challenged to do the hard work of giving things up and taking on new spiritual practices, all to shape us into being more faithful people so that we can follow Jesus wherever he leads. Just like we can't push pause and stay on the mountaintop, the other thing we can't do is push fast forward. Now, how many of you have DVR or are familiar with DVR? Okay, isn't DVR great? Yes. Okay, about a year ago, I went to live with my sister for 4 months in California after she'd given birth to my niece and her husband was on deployment. And my sister, and she'd probably get really upset. I did ask her if I could share this, but she'd still be really embarrassed. She loves a little show on daytime television called Days of Our Lives, and would DVR Days of Our Lives every day. And I have to say that after spending 4 months with her, I ended up watching quite a bit of Days of Our Lives too. Now, the great thing, and probably the only thing that makes daytime television soap operas bearable is the DVR. Because you can fast forward through all of the really terrible commercials, and then after that, you can fast forward through all of those storylines that just like stress you out or are just too painful to watch. So, DVR, don't you agree that there are parts of life, or even parts of our journey of faith, that you would rather just push the fast forward button, get straight to the good stuff? Yeah. I think there's another temptation in that. Just like we want to stay on the mountaintop, sometimes we just want to skip from one mountaintop to the other. And there's this temptation then, especially where we're standing today, to check out during Lent, to skip over Good Friday and to jump straight to Easter. You know, the celebration, the Alleluias, the resurrection. But the resurrection, the sure sign that Jesus has triumphed over sin and death, is completely and utterly meaningless without the crucifixion. There's no new life without death. And Jesus says, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. The thought of losing our lives, or of giving our lives over for the sake of Christ, is terrifying. But you know what? It will change you forever. Once the disciples came down from that mountain and followed Jesus, their lives were never the same again. And you know, Peter, our favorite disciple, who would have rather just stayed on that mountain with Jesus, Jesus built his church, which we can see is alive and well today, on Peter's faith. It's amazing what God can do with our lives when we just make that commitment to step off the mountain and to follow Jesus wherever he leads. God gives us these mountaintop experiences, and we catch glimpses of just how big and how great and how good God is. And while the temptation for us is to stay there, God gives us these experiences as a gift, so we have courage to live life and to walk through the valleys below. As we prepare to come down from this mountain and to journey into Lent, we hear Jesus' call once again that if any want to be my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their crosses, and follow. Following Jesus and losing our lives for his sake is something that can be terribly frightening. It's something that can certainly be challenging, and it's definitely not safe. but it'll change you forever. In death, we find new life. In the cross, resurrection. And so today, I invite you to come down from the mountain. Amen.